Thank you. Minister, I might have missed this. Just on page 113, climate leadership plan expenses are at 6.4 million this year, and 4.65 million next year, and 7.45 million the following. In 2021. So what are the type of things being funded under the what's being funded under that line item?
So the line item for us that has to do with the climate leadership plan is ensuring coal workers have the support they need. So the transition for coal communities, the coal workforce transition fund, everything from bridging to reemployment if someone's looking for new work, bridging to retirement, relocation assistance, training if someone's going back to university, all of those things. And earlier I had the opportunity to just quickly say that we've so far received 14 applications for financial supports as a result of the federal government's decisions to phase out coal. So those were the first coal plants that we're closing down. And so we're very proud that we're able to provide these supports for workers, and that includes somebody on the ground talking to people, making sure they're connected into this.
So is that person on the ground part of economic development? Is there a task force that's still speaking to the mayors and the leaders of those communities to make sure that there is cohesiveness, that these things are actually being done and that the community is able to move on?
So there's two different pieces. So labor is funding something that's very focused on the workers and this workforce transition, and we have people on the ground. EDT is also providing community support that is more broadly for the mayors and those organizations. That being said, the work that we're doing to help with workers, if someone like a mayor wanted to know more about these programs, we'd be happy to make sure they understood. Our contact is more directly with the workers when we go.
So is there also an assessment of how many people have just left that community altogether for other prospects? I know that you had mentioned earlier that you had a number of people that had, some uptake in terms of numbers, which sounded positive that other people were either still employed by the company in other positions, but is there also a gauge of how many people have left the community altogether that might impact other business and labor in those communities?
So unfortunately, I don't think I have this information. The economic development and trade may be able to provide that. What I can tell you, though, is because we provide relocation assistance, only one person has asked for relocation assistance to move away from the community to another location.
Okay, very good. This speaks a little bit to my former career as a paramedic, and you talk about on page 110, outcome 3, workers and newcomers are well prepared to participate in Alberta's dynamic labor market. Now, when we speak about that specifically, we've heard a lot about EMS in the news, and when we think about paramedics and their ability to practice to their full scope. Now, so the question is really more along the lines of how you interact with the Department of Health and the decisions that the Health Department and or the Ministry of Health, the decisions that they make that impact on the ability for somebody to either practice to their full scope. So obviously that includes paramedics and making sure that the regulations allow them to do that. And that also increases employment opportunities for them. And then secondly, when we think about pharmacists and dentists being able to practice to their full scope and be paid appropriately, because I think it's only fair, and I know that the honourable member, the good-looking guy sitting to my left here, Richard Starkey, he talked about, as much as we want to care for the nonprofits, it's the people for profit and the small businesses such as dentists and pharmacists that are feeling a little bit limited now based on capping to certain things that they're allowed to do. And one of those examples would be a pharmacist that's delivering a piece of care or some care and therapy right now is only allowed to bill to a certain amount, but we would allow a physician to bill over and over again. So again, making sure that there's fair labor practices amongst all professions. Where in your budget are you promoting that? And again, how are you working with health and other departments that might impact somebody's ability to practice their full scope and and have quality of life on the job, and also be able to bill in the ways that other professionals bill?
So you've touched on a number of different issues. So I will start with a response, and I'll see if my deputy minister wants to fill in. You started off talking about newcomers and perhaps someone who's trained in another area or another country rather coming to this province. We run an IQOS service that helps with qualification recognition, but we also rely on our professional regulatory organizations to manage a lot of the certifying if someone is sufficiently trained for a particular practice. And so that's not something where the government will impose standards. Rather, we rely on the professionals of those industries to self-regulate and manage that process.
Right.
And that would include health and some of the other areas. Regarding safe work practices, no matter what occupation you were talking about, occupational health and safety officers are able to come into a workplace and advise.
Right. Sorry to interrupt. I just want to focus on making sure that what's fair is fair right across the board in terms of labor practices, and that the government, when it intervenes on particular issues when it regards to health professionals, either limiting them in the way that they bill or limiting them in their practice, to me would be an unfair labor practice. And so again, how you interact to make sure that those things, while you're trying to put the best interests of Albertans forward, I understand that it's not unfair to these particular professions.
Okay. And again, this not being my area of expertise, I believe you're talking about recent negotiations with pharmacists as an example. Right. And I believe that those were negotiated changes where representatives for the pharmacists agreed to those at a negotiating table. And if we have two parties who come to an agreement together, at that point, I don't believe you would refer to that as government intervention. That is a negotiation that had an outcome. Okay. But this is not my area. We're starting to talk about things that the Minister of Health would be the better person
so again,
to
just
talk
would
about.
It be fair to say that sometimes when the government is taking a hard stance, again, trying to negotiate the best price on the taxpayer's behalf, that perhaps embedded in that there is an unfair practice that sometimes happens. There's no way in a human-run department and or government we're valuable. And does the government look inside itself to make sure that there was no unfair negotiating practice and or unfair labor practice to try to correct that again? Because we talked about it before, that government needs to lead by example, that nobody felt bullied into that. And certainly there's some of those sentiments, but it's just to make sure that there are checks and balances within government to make sure that those things are appropriate.
So as Minister of Labour, I'm responsible for making sure there's a fair collective bargaining system when collective bargains are entered into. But as the kind of manager of the system, I don't get involved directly in negotiations themselves. Making sure that there is a fair and balanced system and that adequate negotiations can happen, I think is really important. I'm going to ask if my Deputy Minister has anything to add on this.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is a difficult line of questioning because it's not our area, but I think a couple of things. So the negotiations that happens between the province and the pharmacists, for example, and doctors, sits outside the labour relations framework. And so it's not something we regulate, but I can say the province does have in place structures to sort of oversee, the negotiations with doctors and pharmacists and that sort of thing, and it sort of works through essentially Treasury Board to make sure that all lines up. And so I think that's kind of the oversight body for how we interact with the various professional bodies in terms of fee levels and that sort of thing. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I cede my time. That's good. Thank you.